This paper is focused on gender issues and gender inequalities, which are still persistent in many regions of the world, causing social progress stagnation. Gender equality is considered as a basic human right and a precondition for advancing development, and therefore it has become one of the priorities among other important issues such as climate change or anti-terrorism policies. The objective of this final degree project is twofold. First of all, the purpose is to see what the relationship between the Global Gender Gap Index and fertility rates is. The other objective is to see how much the Development Assistance Committee countries have invested on gender equality and women's empowerment in the form of official development assistance, and also the evolution of those investments during the last years and the years of the financial crisis. The two main areas of interest will be Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, and the purpose is to see how these investments have affected total fertility rates. I have chosen this theme because promoting gender equality and women's empowerment have many positive consequences for the health and productivity of families and the society as a whole, for achieving economic efficiency gains, promoting social development, as well as expanding economic growth. In addition, reducing fertility rates has several positive implications for education, maternal and infant mortality rates, as well as for early marriage, among others. Gender equality has evolved positively in the last quarter century. Women have achieved several attainments concerning their rights, education and health, and access to employment and livelihoods. However, this progress has not affected equally to all countries or all women. For instance, women's mortality rate is higher than that of men in low and middle-income countries, and the representation of women in politics and senior management positions is still much lower than that of men. Gender equality and women empowerment are fundamental objectives included in the Millennium Development Goals, which consist of 8 human development purposes set by the United Nations members. The main target was to eliminate gender disparity in primary and secondary education at all levels by 2015, and nowadays many more girls attend to school than 15 years ago. In 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals were approved. It has set 17 objectives, 9 more than those established before, and the objective about promoting gender equality still remains among the most important ones. Some of the new targets are, for example, eliminating all forms of discrimination and violence against women, eliminating child, early and forced marriage, and female genital mutilation, ensuring women's participation and equal opportunities for leadership and decision-making, and universal access to sexual and reproductive rights, or, for instance, giving women equal rights to economic resources. However, although women's empowerment and gender equality have improved in recent years, there is still a long way to go regarding these important issues. I have said before that promoting gender equality and women's empowerment have many positive consequences, and one of them is achieving economic efficiency gains. Then I will show how the improvement of gender equality will have positive effects on the economic efficiency gains of a country. First of all, it is of great importance to describe what the Global Gender Gap Index is. It refers to an index which evaluates countries depending on how well they divide their resources and opportunities among their male and female populations. Its statistics are designed with the purpose of measuring gender equality. The highest possible score is 1, which means total equality, and the lowest possible score is 0, which means total inequality. The Global Gender Gap Report examines 4 areas of inequality, which are economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, political empowerment, and finally health and survival. To make the regression analysis that shows the relationship between the Global Gender Gap Index and economic efficiency gains, I used data from the 144 countries which compose the list of the Global Gender Gap Report, including those with the highest scores and those with the lowest. This graph confirms a positive correlation between the GDP per capita and the Global Gender Gap Index, which means that as countries get closer to the score 1, that is, reducing the gender gap and empowering women, their GDP per capita increases. So here there is the evidence that a more efficient use of a nation's human capital endowment and the reduction of gender inequalities enhance productivity and economic growth. Women's agency or women's empowerment matters, and that importance can be observed at three different levels. It has intrinsic relevance for women's individual well-being and quality of life, for actions that improve the well-being of women and their families, and also for playing an active role in shaping institutions, social norms, and the well-being of their communities. However, there are some kind of deprivations and constraints that women suffer which need to be removed. For example, women suffer from gender-based violence, that is, physical or sexual abuse of women in their lifetime. They also have limited control over their sexual and reproductive rights, and this fact do not allow women to decide whether or not to reproduce, to decide whether to carry or terminate an unwanted pregnancy, or to choose their favorite method of family planning and contraception. Apart from this, there exists the fact that fewer women than men own land and housing, or that women are underrepresented in formal politics and positions of power. Nowadays, women have fewer children than some decades ago. This figure shows the evolution of world fertility rates for the period 1960 to 2014. In 1960, the average births were about 5 children per woman. Since then, total fertility rates have declined at 50.78%. That is, it has been reduced more than a half. One of the main causes of this reduction has been the use of contraceptives. For instance, figure below displays Latin America's fertility rates. In 1960, average fertility was about 6 children per woman, while in 2014 the average was 2, which means a decline of a 64.54%. The use of contraceptives leads to a reduction in both maternal mortality rates and the number of high-risk births, as well as reduction in sexually transmitted diseases. However, many women are not able to fulfill their fertility expectations, and millions of women have unwanted pregnancies. A reason for that could be the unmet need of contraceptive use, which may result from a difficult access to suppliers, or it may be due to several factors such as distance, insufficient suppliers, or high costs. When women are able to exert some control over decisions about family formations, investment in education, health, and economic opportunities for children are increased. Now I will try to analyze the relationship between two variables. On the one hand, the Global Gender Gap Index, and on the other hand, fertility rates. The hypothesis of this study is that the better the Global Gender Gap Index, the lower the fertility rates among women. In other words, it is expected that there exists a negative relation between them. As it can be observed, the relationship between the two variables is effectively negative, meaning that if the Global Gender Gap Index increases, fertility rates would decrease. The conclusion that can be obtained is that, while most countries follow the pattern of their line and the equation behaving in a similar way, there are some exceptions to the rule. For instance, countries like Yemen or Pakistan, where the Global Gender Gap Index is closer to 0, which means more gender inequality, have the highest rates of fertility. However, there are other countries such as Burundi, whose Global Gender Gap Index is equal to 0.7, but its fertility rate is quite high, being 5.9 the total births per woman in the country, which represents one of the highest rates. A sustained high fertility has several implications for population growth, the age structure, the provision of public services, maternal and child health, and the environment and natural resources. High fertility rates have always been more common in the majority of countries of developing regions. For instance, this graph represents the evolution of fertility rates over the period 1960 to 2014 in different areas of the world. As it can be observed, fertility rates have always been higher in least developed countries than in developed ones. In general, fertility rates have declined in every region of the world, although some of them have done it more intensely than others, such as Latin America. The highest fertility levels are predominant in sub-Saharan Africa. Although its total fertility rates have declined about 25% since 1960, the actual numbers are far from those considered as optimal, and leading to millions of maternal and child deaths, mainly due to unsafe and unhealthy conditions, risk pregnancy, and the lack of required resources. For example, this other figure shows that Niger is the country with the highest fertility rates, followed by Somalia, Mali, and Chad. Its fertility rates are far from those of the developed countries. High fertility rates have several consequences for education, maternal mortality rates, and child mortality. In the first graph, we can observe that as fertility rates increase, the number of maternal deaths will also increase because there are more risky or closely spaced pregnancies. A key component for achieving fertility declines and reductions in maternal mortality is family planning, which allows people to attain their desired number of children. In the second graph, we can observe that as fertility rates increase, infant mortality rates will also increase. In other words, the shorter the birth interval, the greater the risk of mortality. Finally, the last graph shows that as fertility rates increase, the number of children achieving the completion of primary education is lower. In addition, public services like schooling become more challenging where fertility rates are high, as these services need to keep pace with the growing population. Now, this part of the analysis is going to be centered in two big areas of the world where gender disparities have been more pronounced: Latin American countries and Sub-Saharan African countries. To perform this study, I collected data from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development database. The data which is going to be analyzed is the official development assistance provided by TAC members, which is defined as the government aid designed to promote the economic development and welfare of developing countries. The Development Assistance Committee is a forum to discuss issues surrounding aid, development, and poverty reduction in developing countries. The objective is to see how much these DAC countries have invested on gender equality and women's empowerment comparing with the rest of the sectors, and the evolution of those investments during the last years and the years of the financial crisis. There are 7 sectors in which developed countries have invested money over the years: social infrastructure and services, economic infrastructure and services, production sectors, general environment protection, commodity aid or general program assistance, action relating to debt, and finally humanitarian aid. After observing these graphs, it can be concluded that in the year 2014, the largest amount of money has been allocated to social infrastructure and service sector in both Latin American countries and Sub-Saharan Africa. The fact that donor countries have invested the largest amount of money in this sector is of great importance for my study, since it means that countries have invested more in gender and women's empowerment issues. The social infrastructure and service sector includes several subsectors, and one of them is programs and reproductive health, which is related to family planning on reproductive health care. So now let's see what have happened with investments in programs and reproductive health, which is the area of interest. The conclusion after having seen these graphs is that while in Sub-Saharan Africa investments in program and reproductive health have been the highest in 2014, and also throughout the whole period, in Latin America the opposite has occurred, and investments in this area have been the lowest. However, in the years of the financial crisis, investments in this sector suffered a profound decline. Therefore, it is clear that the stage of the financial crisis strongly affected the amount of money allocated to gender issues, and also that the official development assistance suffered a reduction in many other areas. In this graph, it can be observed that over the period 2006-2014, donors has increasingly prioritized the reproductive healthcare resource flows. These flows have increased progressively year by year, and they have followed a positive trend, reaching in 2014 an amount 26 times higher than in 2006. However, in the years of the economic crisis, the amount of money set aside to reproductive healthcare suffered a decline. Reproductive healthcare has been the project in which donor countries have invested more money, followed by family planning and basic nutrition. Nevertheless, contrary to the case of reproductive healthcare, resource flows to family planning has remained constant despite its importance for achieving fertility declines and reductions in maternal mortality. DAC members have become aware about the importance of their investments for overcoming the gender inequality situation affecting hundreds of developing countries. However, although the official development assistance has increased over the period and several improvements have been achieved, it has not been enough to overcome the problem of inequality, and there is still an important gender gap in many regions of the world. This final section of the paper is going to analyze the different scenarios in which fertility rates in sub-Saharan Africa might be affected by the official development assistance set aside to reproductive health care and family planning to see if there exists a negative relation between these variables. These figures show that there effectively exists a negative relationship between these variables. While resources from donor countries flows towards reproductive health care and family planning have increased over the period, fertility rates have been decreasing. It is remarkable that in 2006, when official development assistance was so little, fertility rates were very high. In 2014, although resource flows were 26 times higher, fertility rates were reduced by just 9%. Therefore, despite the huge increase in official development assistance, it does not seem that fertility rates have decreased too much in proportion to investments. One of the most remarkable conclusions obtained is the great importance of gender inequalities for improving women's decision-making power in order to choose when and whom to marry with or how many children to have, which in turn would lead to positive repercussions for women themselves, families, and children. In addition, a more efficient use of a nation's human capital endowment and the reduction of gender inequalities improve productivity and economic growth. The paper has also shown that the sub-Saharan African region have registered the highest fertility rates for many years, and that situation remains nowadays. There also exists a negative correlation between the Global Gender Gap Index and fertility rates, meaning that if the Global Gender Gap Index increases, fertility rates would decrease. Low fertility rates would lead to many positive consequences, such as reducing the number of early marriage, increasing levels of children education, or lowering the percentage of maternal and infant mortality rates. Finally, donor countries have invested more on the reproductive health sector than in other areas such as family planning, basic nutrition, or women's equality organizations and institutions. But although official development assistance flows are 26 times higher in the year 2014 than in 2006, fertility rates have declined just 9%. So it does not seem that fertility rates have decreased too much in proportion to the increase in investments. Therefore, DAC countries must wonder if the money they are investing in this area is being effectively allocated to the purpose and the common objective of reducing the gender gap and empowering women. An effective and efficient solution might be to diversify investments. By doing so, more money will be allocated to fight for gender equality and women's empowerment, to combat domestic violence, to promote poverty reduction through women's empowerment, and indirectly to reduce fertility rates. Thus, donor countries should think carefully about the perfect strategy that optimizes the results, which in this case is to reduce fertility rates. For future investigations, it could be interesting to obtain data at a disaggregated level to see differences in gender equality and fertility rates among countries in the same region. In addition, it could also be really interesting to have data enough so that it could be possible to compare between rural and urban populations, since it is expected that fertility rates are even higher in rural areas and gender equality even lower.